So with the 2024 NFL regular season in the books, I wanted to give you guys my top 20 most disappointing players for the 2024 NFL season because a lot of these players' seasons are finished and I think they were very disappointing relative to their preseason expectations. And you guys can let me know, were these players as disappointing as I'm going to make them out to be, or do you disagree and you don't think they were that disappointing, or just if there's somebody that I didn't mention in this video that you think was one of the more disappointing players in the NFL? Please let me know down below. And subscribe for NFL content all playoffs and off-season long. The first player I want to talk about was coming off an Achilles tear, but he did sign a massive 4-year, $180 million contract with the Atlanta Falcons in the offseason. That's got to be Kirk Cousins, because there's talks that they may cut him or trade him this offseason, and we're just 1 year into that 4-year deal. Now, the way that this contract was constructed, there was a $50 million signing bonus and just $100 million out of the $180 million guaranteed. So there is a potential out after the 2026 season, but that means Kirk Cousins would give the Atlanta Falcons a massive cap hit if they were to get rid of him this year, because they planned on at least having him for 2 years to be that mentor and bridge quarterback for Michael Penix. And here we are after year 1, and he's not even their best quarterback option right now, because Kirk Cousins, they signed him to bring them to the playoffs. The Falcons didn't do that this year. The NFC South was still a very winnable division. That went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Atlanta Falcons didn't win that division or didn't even make a wild card spot this year, with Kirk Cousins appearing in 14 games. He was 7-7 as the team's starting quarterback, 67% completion percentage. He averaged 7.7 yards per attempt, 18 touchdowns to 16 interceptions. He threw for 3,500 yards. He had a game this year against the Chargers where they scored 13 points, and he threw 4 interceptions in December, which is a big game because that could have helped them win the division when it was all said and done. He had stinkers against Minnesota, his former team, against Seattle, against Pittsburgh to start off the year. Even their win against Vegas, he did not look great in that one, and they just won 15-9 against one of the worst teams in the NFL. In passing EPA, he had a negative 3.4 rating this year, which ranked him as the 19th ranked quarterback in the NFL, behind quarterbacks like Aiden O'Connell, Derek Carr, and some other quarterbacks of bad teams this season. It's just a shame that Kirk Cousins' Atlanta Falcons tenure may only last 1 year. I am intrigued to see if they are going to trade him or if they're going to just flat out cut him. And they do look very smart that they drafted Michael Penix in the top 10 in case something like this happened. The next player I want to talk about did make it out of the divisional round, and that was Cooper Kupp of the LA Rams. Yeah, somebody that won the Triple Crown a few seasons ago. He is 31 years old, but the play is declining, because in that Triple Crown season, Cooper Kupp had 1,947 yards across 17 games. He had 16 touchdowns and 145 receptions. The following year, he just played in 9 games in that 2022 season. In 2023, he appeared in 12 games, missing 5, where he just had 737 receiving yards. And this year, appeared in just 12 games, but got off to a great start where he had 14 catches for 110 yards in their week 1 loss to the Detroit Lions, and then proceeded to get hurt in week 2. He comes back on November 3rd against Seattle in an overtime win. He had 11 catches for 104 yards. He had a good game against New England a couple weeks later, but to end the regular season, he had 0 yards against the Niners on 3 targets, 24 yards against the Jets on 3 targets, 29 yards against the Cardinals on 3 targets, and had just 1 target in the divisional round matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. It doesn't seem like Cooper Kupp is that wide receiver 1 anymore. And as he gets older and older, and he's just got so many more injuries, it's hard to think that he's going to ever revert back to what he did in 2021. Next up, I want to talk about a running back that's had a very good career so far until this year, and that is Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, because he was really bad this year. Etienne had 1,000 yards in his first 2 years in the league. In 2022, he had 1,125 yards across 17 games. Last year, in 17 games, he had 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns on the year on the ground and 476 receiving yards. This year, in 15 games, just 558 yards. He averaged 3.7 yards per attempt. He just had 254 receiving yards on 21 less targets this season. He finished with negative 41 rushing yards over expected, which would rank him 38th in the NFL, behind running backs like Jaleel McLaughlin, Ray Davis, Rashad White, and another Jaguars running back, Tank Bigsby. Etienne is 25 years old. He did get his 5th-year option picked up by the Jaguars, but this team is going to have a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator. I'm not sure how involved he's going to be in this team's future plans going forward. He is going to be 26 years old very soon, but they may look into a younger running back or just Tank Bigsby in 2025 and onwards. Next up, I want to talk about a quarterback that had very high expectations going into year number 2. His rookie season was cut short due to injuries, but everybody was very hyped about what he could be as a sophomore, and that is Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts, because now we're having questions. Will he even be the team's franchise quarterback? Richardson ranked 30th in the NFL in terms of EPA, behind quarterbacks like Cooper Rush, Aaron Rodgers, Joe Flacco, Mac Jones. It was a disastrous season for AR. Richardson had a 6-5 record in the 11 games he played in, a 47% completion percentage, one of the worst in the NFL, 8 passing touchdowns to 12 interceptions. He averaged 6.9 yards per throw, and he had just 3 games this year over 200 passing yards, and just 1 game this year over 220 passing yards. Obviously, he's a dual threat quarterback though, and he can make an impact with his legs, and he had some really good games this year running the ball, like against Tennessee or against Detroit or Houston, and he had 2 touchdowns against the Jets in their 28-27 win back in November. He got benched midway through the year for quarterback Joe Flacco, who obviously doesn't have a big future on this Colts team. This was year 2 of what could be a 5-year rookie contract for Anthony Richardson. But yeah, what this offense could have been this year after how good it was last year with Gardner Minshew at the helm, and everybody was hyping up Shane Steichen going into year number 2 as the Colts head coach. It was a pretty disastrous year for the Indianapolis Colts offense, and I wonder what they're going to do this offseason to change that going into year number 3 of Anthony Richardson, if he's still their starting quarterback. The second Atlanta Falcon we're going to talk about in this video is a former 4th overall pick in a loaded 2021 NFL draft. He went in front of Jamar Chase, Penei Sewell, Jalen Waddle, and Devonta Smith. And that is Kyle Pitts, the tight end out of Florida, who was now going into year number 4 with the Atlanta Falcons. And it was just so disappointing again. Pitts was so good in his rookie year with Matt Ryan, where he had 68 catches for 1,026 yards. And that was with an aging Matt Ryan as well, who didn't look like prime Matt Ryan whatsoever. And the last 2 years, the Falcons have had very bad quarterback play with Desmond Ridder, Taylor Heineke, and a couple other guys trying to get Kyle Pitts the ball, where he had just 356 yards in 2022, but he was just 22 years old. Last year, he had 667 yards, a better year, where he also played 7 more games as a 23-year-old. But this year, he had super high expectations because he had Kirk Cousins throwing him the ball, and he got off to a good start as well. Where the first 4 weeks of the season weren't perfect, especially the stinker he had against the Saints, but he had 88 yards in their overtime Thursday night electric win against the Buccaneers. He had 70 yards the week later, 65 against Seattle, 91 against Tampa, but to end off the season, 11 yards, 55, 9-0, 14, 28, 7, 44, and 15. That is just 1 game above 50 yards from November to January. That's not going to get it done, especially for a former top 5 pick just a couple drafts ago. Pitts did get his 5th-year option picked up for the 2025 season, so we can see how he'll be with a full year. That connection with Michael Penix, maybe it's going to be something a little bit better, but we've seen him struggle since his rookie year, and I think we're all done on the Kyle Pitts hype train. We're not taking him high in fantasy anymore, and until he proves us that he could show why he was drafted 4th overall, we just really can't have high expectations for him anymore. Next up, I want to talk about somebody that is just in the news for all the wrong reasons. Every single week, it feels like he's getting cut, and claimed, and that is Deontay Johnson. I don't even know what team he's on right now. I believe he was just claimed by the Baltimore Ravens, which is hilarious because he was traded last offseason from the Pittsburgh Steelers to the Carolina Panthers. He actually wasn't having a bad year with Carolina when they switched from Bryce Young to Andy Dalton. He had a really good week 3 against the Las Vegas Raiders, where he had 8 catches for 122 yards. He had a good week the following one against Cincinnati, where he had 83 yards and a touchdown as well. But then he gets traded to Baltimore, where he just plays 4 games for them, and he had 1 catch for 6 yards. Yeah, that was their big trade deadline pickup as a receiver, and Deontay Johnson could not perform on the field or off the field to the Baltimore Ravens standards. He ends up getting cut. He gets claimed by Houston, who definitely need receiving help with Tank Delhurt and Stephon Diggs. He gets a catch in the wildcard weekend game against the Chargers, and then gets cut a couple days later. The Ravens did just claim him again, but man, it has just been super disappointing for Deontay Johnson this year, who was set to be a free agent this upcoming offseason after getting a 2-year, $36 million contract by the Pittsburgh Steelers a few years ago back in 2022, and I'm sure Pittsburgh is very happy that they didn't attach any more years onto that deal. They trade him for a cornerback, Deontay Jackson, in the offseason, and they're looking very smart in doing so. Same with Carolina getting a day 3 pick for him at the deadline because he's been cut by Baltimore, he's been cut by Houston. Maybe he signs a 1-year veteran minimum deal with Buffalo and Kansas City and he's fixed next year, but it's definitely a big fall off for the 28-year-old receiver. Like Anthony Richardson, the next player I want to talk about was going to year number 2 at the quarterback position. He was the 33rd overall pick back in the 2023 NFL draft, Will Levis. Man, I feel bad for Titans fans this year because they were very hyped up about what Will Levis could be in year number 2 under Brian Callahan. They had Calvin Ridley, who's not going to be featured in this video, but you could definitely mention him as one of the more disappointing players this year. But Will Levis, as a starter, 2-10 this year. 2-10. It's pretty much one and done as his first full-time year as a starter, at least for the Titans. Levis in that 2-10 record had a 63% completion percentage, 2,091 yards, 13 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions on the year. He had 7 fumbles as a rookie. That went up to 10 fumbles this year. He got off to just an embarrassing start as well. It just feels like he was in like the biggest low light of the week, and there was some type of meme on Twitter about him every single week. And he had the worst EPA in the NFL out of all qualified passers. Out of 36 quarterbacks in the NFL, he ranked dead last behind every single quarterback that was qualified this year. So you could make an argument that Will Levis was the worst quarterback in the league this year, which is kind of a shame because I do think Will Levis has a ton of talent, and maybe this is just not his year. Maybe he just wasn't ready to start and have all that weight on his shoulders right now, because I think he's insanely talented. I think he plays insanely hard, but he makes some boneheaded decisions, and we'll see if he's going to be traded this offseason or is just going to be on a different team at the start of 2025 as a backup, and then could maybe turn his career around like we've seen a lot of quarterbacks do recently. Another receiver you could say was disappointing this year relative to standards is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins, who may not be on the Dolphins next year. It seems like he did request a trade at the end of the year. We'll see if he's going to stay on that team, but it feels like he's got to be gone, right? Tyreek Hill is 30 years old, where he's coming off one of the best receiving years we have seen since Cooper Kupp's Triple Crown, where he had 1,799 yards and 13 touchdowns, leading the NFL in both those categories. This year, he actually played one more game than he did last year. 17 games, didn't get hurt at all, 959 yards, down from 1,799 from last year, and 81 catches. He pretty much had 50 less targets and 7 less touchdowns. And this was without Tua Tagovailoa at some times this year, and he had Tyler Huntley throwing him the ball, Skylar Thompson. And Tyreek Hill was ranked in the NFL top 100. Number one. They said he was the best player in the NFL last year, and honestly, I can't disagree with how good he was in that Miami Dolphins offense. But if you follow up that year, which is basically cutting all your numbers in half, and you played one more game this year, and you're making about $30 million a year, yeah, I gotta say you were one of the more disappointing players in the NFL in 2024. We got one kicker and one kicker only in this video. It's the only kicker that has pretty much expectations going into the year that you are going to be the best kicker in the NFL. And that is Justin Tucker. Yeah, Justin Tucker looks maybe washed now. Unfortunately, this was the worst year of Justin Tucker's career. He never had a season with a field goal percentage under 80%. The last time he was under 86% was 2015, where he was at 82%. This year, he hit just 73.3% of his field goals. That is not good whatsoever. He was still perfect on all the shorter field goals. 20 to 29 yards, he was 4 for 4. 30 to 39 yards, he was 7 for 7. But from 40 to 49 yards, 5 of 8. And from 50 yards and on, 6 of 11. So it is looking like he is losing some of that kick power. He's been a Pro Bowler every single year from 2016 to 2023. This was the first year in almost a decade where Justin Tucker was not a Pro Bowler. And like I said, he just has the expectations every single year that you are going to be the best kicker in the National Football League. And anytime he's not, he's probably disappointing to his expectations, but this year they've really plummeted, and I do wonder if Justin Tucker is going to be playing in the NFL next year. Could this be his last dance with the Baltimore Ravens during these playoffs? As he's 35 years old, he's coming off the worst year of his career. Yeah, I do wonder if he's going to be in the NFL next year, because I can't see him playing for any other team than the Baltimore Ravens. I was very high on this player this year, so it may just be me that thinks he's a top 20 most disappointing player in the league. That is Javon Williams, the running back of the Denver Broncos. Javon Williams suffered that ACL tear back in the 2022 season, so I was always going to give him the benefit of the doubt during 2023, where he played 16 games. He had 774 rushing yards, averaged 3.6 yards per carry, and did not look like the same player he was in 2021 and in 2022 before that season-ending injury. And usually running backs coming off these major injuries are going to take a little bit more time to get acclimated back to what they were pre-injury. So we are now over 2 years removed from that injury, and Javon Williams was one of the worst running backs in the NFL this year. He played one more game than last year, and he had 200 less rushing yards than he did in 2023, 139 carries, 513 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns. He averaged 3.7 yards per carry, 30 rushing yards per game. He had 52 catches for 346 yards, and this is the last year of Javon Williams' deal in Denver, as he's an unrestricted free agent this upcoming offseason. There was just a lot of bad games from Javon Williams this year, where there was just a plethora of games under 30 rushing yards against Buffalo, Kansas City, the Chargers twice. He had a game against the Steelers early in the year, 11 carries for 17 yards. He had a game against Vegas back at the end of November where he had 8 rushes for -2 yards, and his longest was 7 in that game. How do you even do that? In terms of rushing EPA, he was a bottom 10 running back in the NFL this year, and I just had higher expectations for him because he was so good before he tore his ACL, and it was a contract year 2 with Sean Payton. He gets a new quarterback in Bo Nix. The offensive line should be better, and everything was better for Denver this year, outside of Javon Williams, pretty much. Next up, I want to talk about our first secondary member in this video, and that is going to be Sauce Gardner of the New York Jets. People are saying we can't even call him Sauce anymore. It's just too cool of a nickname for how bad he was this year. As Sauce's first year in the NFL, his rookie season, he won Defensive Rookie of the Year. He was arguably the best corner in the NFL in 2022, and then he followed that up with an elite 2023 season as well. I don't know if he got too much into golf over the offseason, but he ended up as the 33rd ranked corner according to PFF and dropped to 24th in the NFL in the coverage grade department. And as a rookie, his passer rating allowed was at a 62.9, and that has gone up all the way this year to an 83.3. He allowed 454 yards this year, up from 366 last year. And Gardner wasn't bad this year relative to every corner in the league. He was still a top 40, top 30 corner in the league by most metrics. It's just he has the highest expectations going into the year. He's expected to be a top 3, 5, 10 corner in the NFL. So when you end up far outside of that, you are disappointing relative to your expectations going into the year. Let's stay on the top of secondary members. This time we're going to go into the safeties, and I want to talk about Minkah Fitzpatrick of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who I think had one of the worst years, if not the worst year of his career this year. Somehow made a Pro Bowl. He was not deserving of that. Last year, Minkah allowed a 67 QB rating against him. This year, that almost doubled to 126. He allowed 373 yards this year, up from 169 last year. Now, he was hurt last year, so he has played more games this year, so that is skewed a little bit, but it just feels like Minkah hasn't made the big-time plays that he has in the past. He's not that elite run-stopping safety as he used to be. He's still good in that department, but not at the best of the best that he's been for most of his time in Pittsburgh. PFF ranked him as the 43rd ranked safety in the NFL. He was 20th last year, 3rd in 2022. He was the 33rd out of 97 graded in their coverage department for safeties, and 47 out of 91 in their run defense department. He had 1 interception this year. He had 96 total tackles, and I know the Steelers secondary wasn't great, especially in the second half of the year, but I just feel like it was a down year for Minkah Fitzpatrick, who has super high expectations going into the year pretty much every year until we think he's officially washed, which hopefully isn't for a little bit. Next up, I want to talk about Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. And Deebo was very disappointing as well. Now, he dealt with some injuries this year and pneumonia as well, but he did appear in 15 games. He had 51 catches for 670 yards and 3 touchdowns. That is down from 892 yards last year, and he played the same amount of games, going from 7 touchdowns as well last year to 3 touchdowns, as I mentioned this year. He had 5 rushing touchdowns last year, down to 1 this year, and he has had his lowest amount of rushing yards since that 2020 season. So now you're losing one of the best aspects of Deebo Samuel, and that's why he's getting paid wide receiver 1 money, is because he was this hybrid style receiver that can do it all out of the backfield and out wide. You're not getting that from him anymore, and he is now 29 years old. And I do wonder if Deebo and the Niners are going to part ways this offseason, either by getting cut or traded. Now, I would say my next player being disappointing isn't really his fault. It's just he had super high expectations going into the year. Could he break the rookie receiving record? Because Marvin Harrison Jr. had those expectations and all that hype going into year number 1. So I would say he fell short of those expectations, which were insanely high, but that still means it was a little bit disappointing. But I think this Arizona Cardinals offense as a whole was pretty much disappointing outside of maybe what Trey McBride did this year, even though he could barely find the end zone. Marvin Harrison Jr. had 62 catches for 885 yards and 8 touchdowns, and those are good numbers for a rookie receiver, but he didn't look as explosive as maybe he once did at Ohio State this year. Malik Neighbors looked a lot better. Brian Thomas Jr. and Ladd McConkey all looked better than Marvin Harrison Jr. this year, and he had better QB play than pretty much all of those guys outside of McConkey. He was definitely blessed with a better quarterback over in Arizona than what was going on in Jacksonville with Mac Jones at one point, and obviously everything that happened with the New York Giants this year. So I think just all things considered, Marvin Harrison Jr. did have a disappointing year, but I think he will bounce back in year number 2 and should get over that 1,000-yard threshold. Next up, I want to talk about somebody that got traded last offseason, and he held out wanting a new contract this year, and that is Haason Reddick of the New York Jets. Reddick held out for the first half of the season. He ended up playing just 10 games for the Jets this year, and he finished with 1 sack throughout 10 games. He started 2 of them. He finished with 1 pass deflection, 1 forced fumble, and 14 total tackles, and just 3 QB hits. In those 10 games that he played, PFF had him graded as the 104th edge rusher in the NFL out of 118. It was just a disaster season for Haason Reddick and the New York Jets. They could not get along. They could not agree on a new deal, and he's going to be a free agent, so his time in New York is definitely over. I don't know if my next player being disappointing comes back on the quarterback that we talked about earlier, but I talked about Anthony Richardson. I think Michael Pittman Jr. Jr. was disappointing this year, just because I think Josh Downs and even Alec Pierce in their roles in this offense were more impactful than Michael Pittman. Pittman had the worst year since his rookie season back in 2020. He finished with 808 receiving yards, which was the lowest since 2020, where he had 503, lowest reception since 2020, lowest touchdown since 2020 as well, and his lowest catch percentage of his career at 62.2%. First time ever having a negative receiving yard EPA season, the lowest amount of yak in his career, and the lowest amount of routes run. And even though he's played 16 games over the last 3 seasons, he looked like a true wide receiver 1 at the end of 2023 with Gardner Minshew throwing in the ball. And I think just Josh Downs and Alec Pierce looking a little bit better, like I said, in their roles makes this look a little bit worse for Michael Pittman this year. But Colts fans, you can let me know, who was more disappointing, Pittman or Richardson? Who does it come down on? Whatever expectations you had of this player, just throw him out. Throw him out. They're done. His career may be over, and that is Deshaun Watson in Cleveland. I think this probably comes down on Browns fans a little bit more. They were the only fan base that probably had any expectations for Watson this year, and he ended up being the worst quarterback in the NFL throughout 7 games before he ended up tearing his Achilles, where he went 1-6 in those 7 games. He had a 63% completion percentage, 1,148 yards, 5 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, but honestly just looked terrible out there. I think he was so much worse than the stats give him credit for, because they got blown out by Dallas with him starting the season. They barely beat the Jaguars, who were one of the worst teams in the league. They lose to the Giants, one of the worst teams in the league as well, by 6. Lose to Vegas, Washington, Philly, and then Cincy in that game where he ended up tearing his Achilles. He's making so much money, and he may be injured all of the 2025 season as well. It is going to go down as one of the worst, if not the worst trade in NFL history, followed by the worst contract extension in NFL history. And I think that ends up making you one of the more disappointing players in the NFL, because we are so far from what he was in that 2020 season when he led the NFL in passing yards. The only offensive lineman I'm going to have in this video is Jawan Taylor of the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs offensive line as a whole this year was really good, but it was mainly on the interior of Joe Thuney, Creed Humphrey, and Trey Smith, as Jawan Taylor was not good whatsoever as their offensive tackle. He signed a massive 4-year, $80 million contract with the Chiefs in 2023, and he didn't have a good first year in Kansas City, and he followed that up with not much better of a year 2, where he ranked as the 61st offensive tackle out of 81 in the NFL, according to PFF. He wasn't great in the run block. He was slightly better in the pass blocking department, but was around league average, and for somebody making $20 million a year, that's pretty inexcusable. He had 17 penalties this year, which is very high for an offensive tackle. He allowed 7 sacks, 6 QB hits, and 37 total pressures. So they pretty much can't cut him till the end of the 2025 season, so we'll see if he's going to be better in year number 3. Let's say a team had to give up a valuable draft pick, and then you had to sign a 4-year, $76 million extension for this player, and he ended up being the worst graded corner in the NFL, 117th out of 117th. Well, that's pretty much what happened with Maurice Sneed and the Tennessee Titans. So yeah, I gotta mention Maurice Sneed in this video. Sneed was arguably the worst corner in the NFL this season, and he's going to be making around $19 million a year in 2025. There is a potential out after the end of the 2025 season where they can afford to just take on $12 million in dead cap instead of cutting him this year at $35 million. But man, this guy was so good in Kansas City. He was one of the best corners in the league with Steve Spagnuolo and that Kansas City Chiefs defense, but maybe he was a product of that defense. He's still just 27 years old, and he just fell off a cliff this year. Maybe he just didn't fit this Titans defense well whatsoever, but you would have to say this is a disaster for one of the big pickups of the Titans in that 2024 offseason. This Jets offense as a whole this year, super disappointing. And I wanted to talk about at least one Jet. I wasn't going to talk about Aaron Rodgers, but you could definitely mention him. I'm going to talk about Bryce Hall, who was arguably the best running back in the NFL, or at least in those conversations after Christian McCaffrey going into this year. And he's not even close to those conversations right now. Bryce appeared in 16 games this year, just down from 1 last year. 876 yards on the year, 5 touchdowns as well. He averaged 54 yards per game, 4.2 yards per carry. Didn't look as explosive as he did last year, and at times Braylon Allen played a little bit better than Bryce. His rushing yards over expected drop, rushing yards over expected carry drop, his rushing yards EPA dropped. He had 5 fumbles compared to 2 last year. Basically every metric of Bryce Hall's game this year was down from last year's season. So I'm not saying he was bad overall. I would still want Bryce Hall starting on my team. He's better than Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, my favorite team's running backs. It's just what his expectations were going into the year definitely fell short of those, which makes him my final spot on my top 20 most disappointing NFL players of the 2024 season. So that is gonna be it for me. Hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, I would appreciate you dropping a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments who you think was disappointing or not this year, and hit that subscribe button if you were not already, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.